Maryland. My name is Gary Allen. I see some of you are signing on. Very pleased to have all of you. The Maryland Forestry Foundation is very pleased to be presenting today's webinar in our series, Framing the Future. We're excited to focus on the data sources for how we know what's going on in the woods in Maryland. Some of you may be familiar with the recent studies carried out in this area that form the basis for new public policy for the Forest Conservation Act in Maryland. Those of you who are a part of that policy process or familiar with it in detail know that a number of very specific data sources are cited in the process of making public policy in forest cover. Today, we're pleased to have a couple of the leaders in that area to share with us. It's a part of our series of trying to provide the basic information to all of you about how forest policy in Maryland is shaped for the future, about issues that will affect forest policy for years to come, and ultimately a lot of the quality of life for Maryland citizens. As usual, our host for it's my pleasure to be the host, but as usual, our moderator for the series is Megan Carr. So I'm going to turn to Megan and ask her to introduce today's panelists. Megan?
Great, thank you, Gary. Yeah, so I'm Megan Carr. I am here to get things moving through. Just want to give a couple of notes to our participants. So this webinar is being recorded and will be hosted on the Maryland Forestry Foundation's website at a future date. So do keep an eye out for that if you'd like to revisit any of this information later. If you have questions for our panelists, they are very welcome. Please add those into the Q&A chat box. For most users, you'll be able to find that at the bottom of your screen. So for today's talk, very excited. It's a really interesting subject to delve into. Coming from a forest management perspective, forest managers, we need to have a good understanding of existing conditions relative to our goals. But our understanding emerges from the data sets that are available and, of course, the analyses of them. And those data sources can influence the information that we have to work with. So to get into the literal and theoretical weeds on this, we have two excellent researchers joining us. I'd like to first introduce Tanya Lister, who is a research forester with the Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis, or FIA, program, working out of York, Pennsylvania. She is an FIA state analyst with research interests that include forest fragmentation, urbanization, and land use change. Tanya has been involved in the Urban FIA program since its start in 2013 and is helping lead urban analysis and reporting efforts for the Northern Research Station. So thanks for joining us again, Tanya, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Megan. Just going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so glad to be here. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Today, I'll be talking about using forest inventory and analysis, or FIA, data to understand forest dynamics in Maryland. And just a brief overview here. I'm going to give basic background on the Forest Inventory and Analysis program, talk about Maryland forest statistics and trends, including forest area, species composition, volume and carbon, forest structure, forest sustainability and health. And I'm going to end with some information on FIA data access tools and digital content. So many of you are probably familiar with the FIA program with field plots across the US on all ownerships. FIA has a long history of monitoring the status and health of forests. In Maryland, FIA inventories date back to the 1950s. And you can see here the mission is to improve the understanding and stewardship of the nation's forests. We do this through annualized inventories of the nation's forest resources, analysis of the data, and distribution of the inventory results. So FIA is a field-based sample inventory in which tree and site data are collected on a network of ground plots distributed uniformly across the landscape. And because the inventory is designed as a statistical sample, traditional error estimates like confidence intervals, can be produced for each estimate. So this gives users an index of the reliability of the estimates. The sampling frame is based on a hexagonal grid overlain over the US, and there's one FI ground plot randomly located within each 6,000 acre hectare or hexagon. So basically one plot per 6,000 acres. So across the entire US, there are more than 300,000 plots at full implementation. Field crews take measurements on plots that have forest land, so about half of those plots are visited. But we don't collect the data all at once. In the annualized design, 1/5 to 1/10 of the plots are measured each year, depending on the state. And in Maryland, there are about 982 plots in total, 433 of which contain forest. And this full cycle of data is collected over 7 years. So what does FI do on each plot? They collect a variety of land condition variables like forest type, stand size, land cover. They map land uses. Tree data is recorded too, including species, diameter and heights, damage, merchantability information, and computed variables like biomass, carbon, and GRM, growth removals and mortality. There are other forest health related variables collected on a subset of plots. And data are stored in a relational database and processed to produce population level estimates using estimation techniques, modeling, and GIS remote sensing analyses. FI reports on the status and trends of the nation's forest resources, including the transfer of data to our partners. We also do basic and applied research and provide information for policy. The data are available to the general public, and there are tools and dashboards that help users understand the data, and I'll be sharing a few of those with you during this presentation. So in the traditional FIA inventory, tree data are primarily collected on FIA-defined forest land. So it's important to understand FIA's definition of forest land. And generally speaking, forest land is land that has at least 10% crown cover by live trees, or land that formerly had tree cover, like if an area is harvested, as long as the land is not being developed for a non-forest use. It's still considered forest land. So there's also size requirements. The forest patch has to be at least an acre in size and 120 feet wide. And some of the trees that fall outside of FIA's traditional forest land definition are captured in the urban FIA inventory and in FIA's trees outside of forest land research. But the focus of today's talk is on that FIA traditional forest land inventory. So here in the map at the top, you can see the distribution of forest across Maryland, with darker green shading having a larger percent forest land by area. By FIA's definition, Maryland is 37% forested, and you can see the highest concentrations of forest land in Garrett County and Allegheny counties to the west, and also in the southern region of Maryland. So overall, there's an estimated 2.4 million acres of forest land. And in the figure below, we see forest and timberland trends over time. Timberland is forest land that meets a certain minimum productivity standard and isn't reserved by law from being harvested. So in Maryland, timberland accounts for about 89% of this forest land, or 2.2 million acres. The remaining 11% of forest land is reserved from timber production. We can see in the inventory since the early 1960s a pretty consistent decrease in forest land area, and that change has softened since about 2010, according to FIA data. So we just looked at trends in forest land area over time by comparing full population level estimates, but we can also look at the plot level data, the plot level remeasurement data, to see how the current and previous forest land and non-forest land uses compare. So here you see the approximate distribution of FIA plots and their associated land use. We can compare this to data gathered at the previous plot visit and look at the plots that change. So here we see the change plots that went from non-forest to forest show gain, and they're colored blue, and those went from forest to non-forest show loss, and they're pink. Green plots indicate forest that remained forest. So we see for this most recent inventory period, that translates into about an annual gross gain in forest land of 5,000 acres and a gross loss of about 14,000 acres per year, which means that the net forest loss is about 9,000 acres per year in Maryland, according to FIA data. So what are the compositional characteristics of the forest land? Here we have the distribution of forest type groups across the state. We see widespread distribution of oak hickory throughout Maryland, covering 60% of the total state area. Loblolly pine, shortleaf pine group cover about 16% of the forest area, predominantly in the lower eastern shore, and maple beech birch at about 8% coverage, mainly in the western parts of the state. And now we'll move into an exploration of FIA's tree level data. So overall, there's approximately 1.4 billion trees greater than 1 inch in diameter in Maryland, including about 85 different species. The most abundant species, 1 inch and larger, is red maple, but when you take out the sapling sized trees, as we've done in the figure on the right, you can see that loblolly pine takes the lead as the most prevalent species with 68 million trees, 5 inches and larger. And about half of those are in the saw timber size class. And here's a look at some of the dominant species in Maryland in terms of proportion of trees by 2 inch diameter class. The oaks and yellow poplars are better represented, as you can see, in the larger diameter classes than in the smaller diameter classes. And that contrasts with sweet gum, American holly, and black gum, which have disproportionate shares of trees less than 5 inches in diameter compared to their presence in trees greater than 20 inches in diameter and larger. So red maple, you can see, occurs in large numbers pretty much across all diameter classes, and other major species like the loblolly pine, hickory, black cherry, and beech are fairly well distributed across diameter classes as well. So comparisons of species composition by size can provide some insights into future changes in overstory species. And one concern is making sure we have an adequate supply of sapling and pole timber trees for the replacement of oaks and tulip poplars as the larger older trees eventually die. So let's look at the trends in tree volume now. This graph shows pretty consistent increases in tree volume since 1950. Tree volume has increased by 16% to 5.9 billion cubic feet over the last decade. And most of that volume increases in hardwood species. Here we see the trends in volume by species group going back to 2008, with the more prevalent species groups on the top figure, and in this bottom figure, select species groups that are less prevalent. In the top figure, trends are subtle, but we see a general increase in loblolly, shortleaf pine, and yellow poplar species groups. And in the lower graph, increases in beech and hickory species groups, and expected decreases in ash due to the effects of emerald ash borer. So forest carbon is a topic of great interest, so I wanted to just touch briefly on it here. The FIA program uses a combination of field measurements and models to estimate carbon stocks. Forest carbon, as you can see, is often broken down into storage pools. In the graph, there are the various components: live biomass, which includes trees and understory vegetation, dead wood, including standing dead trees and down dead wood, and forest floor litter and soil organic matter. So the total ecosystem carbon stocks in Maryland are about 255 million tons, and this represents an increase of about 1% since 2013, and an increase of about 3% since 2008. As you can see in the graph, soil organic carbon and live trees are the largest components, and combined, these account for about 90% of the forest carbon stocks in Maryland. So FIA carbon data are compiled as a component of the National Greenhouse Gas Report, which is submitted annually to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And data on these models are also made available to states. I believe Grant Domke and others just published the last collection of state estimates last week from the latest report. We're going to move now to forest structure. So Maryland forests have been maturing, as is shown here by the shift in forest area towards older stand diameter or older stand age classes. You can see the age distribution kind of moving to the right over time as you go from the gray bars to the green to the blue. The distribution of timberland by stand size class supports this trend. You can see since about the 1973 inventory, there's been a general trend of increasing acreage in large diameter stands with decreasing acreage in medium and small diameter stands. And this supports the idea of an aging resource and may have implications for overall forest health and have an effect on different wildlife species that depend on younger forest habitats. Moving on to some information on forest sustainability and health. So one way to judge the sustainability of a forest is to examine the components of annual change in inventory volume, growth, removals, and mortality. The net growth of sound volume on forest land in Maryland is 132 billion cubic feet per year, and that's a decrease from 152 million in 2015. And there's 56 billion cubic feet of removals. So taking those estimates together, we can see that the growth to removals ratio is relatively high in Maryland at 3.89%. And mortality is about 39% of gross growth. So although ash species aren't one of the most abundant trees in Maryland's forests, we can talk about mortality. We can't talk about mortality without giving mention to the effects of emerald ash borer here in Maryland. So you see the plots affected by ash at 2 points in time, in 2008 and 2019. Colored plots from green to red indicate increasing numbers of dead ash on inventory plots. And the maps show an increasing number of plots with dead ash and plots with greater concentrations of dead ash. So over the last 5 years, FIA analysts have been developing more and more interactive digital products that highlight issues of importance and help sort of tell a story with the FIA data. So this is an interactive dashboard that was created by Randy Morin, a researcher at FIA. And I didn't want to like go online and have a disaster in my presentation. So I'm not going to show you sort of the interactive components, but I'm going to kind of explain these dashboards a little. When you're live, you can click on the map and see inventory data for each county. And there's an informational sidebar that kind of explains how to adjust the dashboard URL to display regional data or data for other states. This background map is the basal area of ash per acre, and dark green pixels in the map represent more ash. The shaded county map overlay shows the year of emerald ash borer infestation. And looking at sort of the indicators at the top, we see the annual net growth rate is 0 for ash, as expected, annual mortality rate at about 8%, annual removals at 1.7%. In the bar graphs, we see live volume drop in 2019, and it's hard to see on the far right, but it displays the growth, removals, and mortality data by county. So you can see mortality and removals far exceed the small amount of growth recorded for most counties. So oaks are another species group of concern in Maryland due to the increase in mortality and decline that's being observed in the state. Here's a plot map, another plot map showing white oak mortality in 2008 and 2019. And you can really see the increase in the numbers of plots affected and the increasing numbers of white oak mortality per plot. The volume of white oak mortality has risen to 95% of net growth for that species. And in talking to some of the Maryland DNR Forest Service folks, it's likely that heavy and long rains and flooding in 2018 may have caused root damage. And then the droughts in 2019 stressed the trees and they became susceptible to insects and diseases. So we're continuing to look into what in the FI data can tell us possible additional factors resulting in oak mortality. So oak mortality is a concern across the region. Here's another dashboard highlighting FIA data on oak mortality for the Northern Research Station states. The map shows county level estimates of oak mortality going from low levels in lighter yellow to the higher levels of mortality in dark orange. The oak species are divided into 4 species groups, including white and red oaks. And at the NRS level, we can see that the mortality rate among the oak species groups ranges from about 0.6 to 1.5%. And now we'll adjust the URL. You can adjust the URL down here at the bottom to display only Maryland data. So we see that the mortality rate for select red oaks and other white oaks is higher than the regional average. In Maryland, average annual oak mortality is 17 million cubic feet, an increase of 20% since 2014. And the bar graph shows oak mortality is the highest in the north central unit of the state. Another challenge for oak sustainability is regeneration. And here's a dashboard focusing on understory health. On a small subset of FIA plots, FIA field crews collect information on understory vegetation, regeneration information, and invasive plants data, and other metrics. So in this map, you can see the distribution of forest health plots, and you see in the pie chart at the bottom of the page, about 57% of the state has moderate to very high levels of browse impact. Here's another interactive dashboard that explores FI tree damage data. So the map displays the percent of damaged trees and damaged trees per acre. The bar chart in the middle displays the proportions of each damage type by species. And the bar at the bottom is the total for all species. And I know it's kind of hard to see, but the vast majority, 82% of the trees have no damage that met the threshold of injury necessary by FIA's definition. But among the damage types recorded for all species, the decay, disease and parasite type, here in pink, has the greatest proportion of the total. You can also use the dashboard to explore specific species. So there's a button up here, the common name drop-down menu. So let's just fool around with this and try the oak species. And we see the distribution of oak trees with damage now in the map. The western and southern parts of the state have the highest densities of trees with damage. And it looks like the most common damage type among oak species is the same as for all species combined, that decay, disease, and parasites class. And it looks like scarlet oak has the, oops, thought maybe okay. It looks like scarlet oak in the list of different oak species has the highest proportion of damaged trees among the oak species at 23%. So there's a lot more that I could cover reporting on forest characteristics and dynamics using FIA data, but I just wanted to take a little time to point out how you can access the data and extract the content you want for your specific interests. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about data access. And really, the best place to go to interact with FIA data, to find links where you can interact with FIA data, is the Data and Tools page, which the URL is here at the top. From here, you have access to the FIA data library, in red there on the left, and links to field guides, and then the user guides, which you can link to at the top here. You can also see on this page the Data Mart, which is where relational data tables containing all published FIA data are available for download. Here's a link to the state fact sheets. So state fact sheets are updated annually and display basic state level FIA data and trends. And they also have links to a comprehensive set of standard tables available for the most recent data. So let's just click on that and it brings you to this page. You can, click on a state that you're interested. We'll select Maryland and it brings up the most recent fact sheet for Maryland. This is a one-page summary of high-level highlights, basically. And there's an FIA team currently working on creating a more in-depth fact sheet. We used to have sort of an annual report that was a 4-page fact sheet or report. And I think folks liked to have a little bit more in-depth analysis of the data annually. So this is being revised, but right now this is what they look, and they're consistent across the nation. So below the fact sheet link is the eValidator app. eValidator allows users to produce tables and a large variety of population estimates and their sampling errors based on the current FIA database. The app is relatively user-friendly. It's where I go every day, to look something up. It's my favorite table making tool. There is another available, but I just wanted to point this one out. It's a series of drop-down menus, and you can create the table that you want, and it uses an API interface to interface with the FIA database. So if you get kind of savvy, you can actually create a single query and then if you want to see it for a different state, it's easy to kind of inject that different state code into the URL, and it makes querying the data quick. There's so much more to explore on this data and tools page, including, you may have seen the urban FIA data access. I think there was a webinar earlier that you might want to check out that talked about the urban FIA data in this series. There's also the National Woodland Owner Survey, Table Maker, the Timber Products Output Toolkit. And as we scroll down further, you see this Geospatial Showcase link. And this is where you can find many of the interactive dashboards I just shared today and additional geospatial data products. So with that, I am finished, and I will be excited to entertain any questions after Jarlath's talk, and I'm looking forward to seeing what Jarlath's presentation has.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanya. And I am excited to dig into some of those tools. So I've been over here jotting some notes down for accessing those later. But yes, let's jump into Jarlath's presentation. Very excited. Jarlath O'Neill Dunn is the director of the University of Vermont Spatial Analysis Laboratory and holds a joint research scientist appointment with the USDA Forest Service. He is passionate about using remote sensing technology to tackle pressing issues in the fields of environmental science, climate change, sustainability, disaster response, and urban forestry. So thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. And I'll jump right into it. So I'm going to talk today about a different way of mapping our forests, and that's from above. And Tanya gave such a great overview about how we do it on the ground. And I think for too long, we've seen the approaches from above, what we call remote sensing. Perhaps some people think they're in competition or should be done instead of our measurements on the ground, but that's not true at all. These are complementary. And the fact is that We just don't have enough money. We don't have the resources to map, monitor, and understand our forests in all the way we would like to. So we need to take multiple approaches. And from above, we have the distinct advantage that we can see everything, but it's really important to keep in mind that we can't get into much of the level of detail that Tanya's talking about in terms of species, in terms of health and things like that. But once again, we have that advantage that we can do it over larger areas. And I like to focus this presentation on the work that we're doing actually throughout the United States. And I think that'll give you a flavor of what's out there. And it's also the foundational work that led into that technical study that has given you a lot of insights into what's happening with Maryland's forests. I'm going to focus a lot of the data and the methods and less on some of the stats, because I think those are covered really nicely in the report, and there is a separate webinar on that. So let's get into it. So I got my start with satellite remote sensing as an undergraduate. This is the Landsat satellite. We've had a constellation up there since the 1970s, and I was doing high elevation forest decline mapping, both in the northeastern United States and Eastern Europe. And then my colleague and good friend Morgan Grove, who's on the webinar here, he got me started into urban forestry, and it's a much different landscape. It's much more difficult to see these assets, these green assets. And if you're in New York City, right, you're spending thousands of dollars to put one of these trees in the ground. And how do we map and monitor and account for these trees? It's really, really challenging. And I think we're in an exciting time right now, right? If you go back over a decade ago, everyone started doing data analytics for city government or for state government. And I think the folks that were left out of that largely was forestry. And I think what you've seen Tanya present there from FIA has changed that. I think what we're doing with remote sensing from above has changed that. But you can imagine what it was like back then when everyone would get around the table. The police could talk about crime, DPW could talk about number of roads that needed paving, right? Public Works could talk about trash pickup, all of these things, but we never really had any good data about our forests. And I'm really proud to be part of the movement that's changing that. So there's always been this missing piece of the puzzle, right? It could be like Tanya was talking about, right? What's happening to our species and the health, especially with ash, or just basic things like understanding who owns our tree canopy, right? How much land do we have to plant trees? What's happening to our tree canopy over time? And as Tanya mentioned, right, there's great ways of doing this on the ground. The problem is that we can't get to all trees. We've got not only just the resource issues, but also just the fact that we can't cross into everyone's property. And so that's where mapping from above comes in, right? We have amazing satellites, we've got planes. I'll also talk later about drones. And it's this technology that gives us a wonderful way to comprehensively understand our forest resources, although without quite the depth that we have in FIA. And this is why these techniques and these approaches are highly complementary to help you tell the story of your forest and what's happening, right? And for a long time, we've mapped our forests from above the United States. We've done that using satellites that have 30-meter pixels. You can see these pixels here. They are darker when they represent more tree canopy. And of course, they just don't account for all the trees, right? And particularly in our urban areas and our suburban areas, it's really challenging to map these trees because our landscape's highly fragmented. And we know with some of the research that we've done in collaboration with our colleagues at University of Maryland that estimates like things like carbon stocks are really off when we exclude these trees, not to mention that we're not capturing the green assets that are so crucial to equity and our comfort and livability in our urban and suburban areas. We can make use of this wonderful imagery, and what's great about the technology we have nowadays is it sees light that we as humans cannot see, which helps us map vegetation. However, one of the challenges always is that particularly in our urbanized areas, it's difficult to see things because of the shadows, like what you see here, right? What's happening in there? It doesn't matter even if we have 6-inch resolution imagery, it's difficult to figure out what's going on there. And so we've got exciting new technologies such as LiDAR, which is what you see here. This is what we call a point cloud. It's collected by a laser mounted on a plane. If you don't have to put your tinfoil hat on, it's not that dangerous. It's near infrared light, so we as humans can't even see it, but it generates these 3D models, what we call a point cloud, in which all these little dots have X, Y, and Z locations. And because it's shooting out a laser, as opposed to relying on the sun's energy, we can see our landscape in in 3D. And it's really remarkable technology. So if we look at that same area that was in the shadow, there it is, right? We can clearly see the vegetation. And the advantages of LiDAR are numerous. Not only can we see through shadows, but it's extraordinarily precise. So in imagery, sometimes things lean, which can make it difficult for us to determine if the trees are growing or not. But with LiDAR, we have that level of precision. And not only that, it just looks beautiful. These point clouds, they're wonderful to look at, particularly when you zoom in, right? You get not only this great and precise and accurate mapping of the landscape, but it's also in 3D. And some ways in which it's quite useful actually is figuring out what's happening in our understory, because we know that not all tree canopy is created equal, right? And this is particularly true as we move into these forested areas, right? We can probably guess here that under some of these trees here, it's not a natural landscape, and in other places it may be natural, right? We've got more of an understory, but it's hard to tell from imagery alone. And with LiDAR data, so we're looking at that same area here, right? So if we take LiDAR data, we look at it in 3D, and then I'm just going to drop this, what we call a profile line through here, and I'm going to extract all those little points that make up the LiDAR point cloud. And what we can see here is as we move from the northern point there, so I'll move back in the from place to the to, where it's got the measurement about 100 meters here. So as you go from left to right, that's the from, the to, you can see we go from more of a natural understory, right, to more of a managed understory where there's probably mowing going on. So this technology allows us to better characterize our forests, not just by giving us the height of trees and other information, but letting us know more detailed information about the understory. And in places where we have LiDAR, we can do it everywhere. And I really hope you walk away with this presentation understanding the power of these data, which are used for many things: urban planning, construction, transportation, asset management, but also for our urban forests. And it's really crucial that we continue to advocate for them so that we can have this technology to map and monitor our forests going forward. So much of what we do involves extracting features, right? The imagery in these LiDAR data sets are wonderful, but we need to extract information from it so we can quantify things. So we can tell you what's happening to tree canopy in Maryland or Baltimore, or maybe even down to the individual school properties, right? So we take these amazing data sets, we integrate them with imagery and the LiDAR, we extract our tree canopy and all of our other features. We like to say that we map your green, your gray, your brown, and your blue infrastructure so that you have a precise accounting of everything. This is a real change, right? A decade ago, we mapped our roads, we mapped our buildings, we mapped our property parcels. Now, thanks to the advances in the urban tree canopy assessment program through the Forest Service, which is no longer just urban, we're doing all lands and partners with Chesapeake Conservancy and the Chesapeake Bay program. We're on our third iteration now of mapping the entire Chesapeake Bay watershed at a 1 meter resolution. We can give people that accurate accounting so that as a forestry community, when we come to the table with everyone else, we can do so with accurate numbers. And when we have this stuff, we can do very simple GIS analyses, the kind of GIS that I learned when I took intro to GIS in the 1990s, just overlay property ownership things and answer questions like who owns the trees. We can look at equity, an interesting thing that came out of our Los Angeles study that we worked on with folks like Dexter Locke, who's on the call. If we look here, we can see that in Los Angeles, 1% of the 1% of the population controls 20% of the tree canopy, right? Not at all equitable, especially given the fact that they're predicted to have thousands of deaths from the urban heat island as they move into the middle part of this century, right? We need to capture that information, and we can only do that if we have accurate mapping. Other things that we're able to do now that are really, really exciting is we can take this imagery, take this LiDAR data, and we can do things like actually map the locations of individual trees. So before, when we were just giving you numbers that said you've got, X hundred number or thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres, whatever the unit of analysis is of tree canopy, now we can estimate the number and size of those trees, both the crowns and the height of them. And this is particularly valuable. And here it is overlaid on imagery. And then let's take a look at the LiDAR data here. And it's this type of sort of accounting that we've never been able to do until the data and the methods have advanced. And we found communities throughout the United States that find this really compelling, right? When you're able to walk in to your city government, your county government as an agency and say, hey, do you know that we're actually responsible for managing 782,000 trees, right? It's a pretty impressive number. Or if you want to do risk assessments because you're looking at trees and proximity to utility lines or things like that, all of that comes out in this type of analysis, right? And because it's attributed with height, even though we can't give you the level of information that FIA gives, we can map these heterogeneous areas quite well. And we can use height sometimes as a proxy, especially in places like Maryland, for age, and say, you know, how is the distribution of your forest looking? Are you looking like you've got a bunch of really taller, older trees? Is most of your stuff stacked younger, or do you have a more of a normal distribution? We can look at patch sizes. We know that larger patches provide greater ecosystem services, especially for wildlife, and we can provide those types of statistics, and you see those in the Maryland Technical Forest Study. I think what's very interesting is our ability to do change detection now. I mentioned we're in our third iteration of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, a monumental undertaking that involves a small army of people that are sitting outside my office door here. And it's really, really challenging. We just flip back and forth between these two images here. And just take a look, the shadows are shifting, right? It's really, really difficult, even though we have this great imagery and it's incredibly detailed, to figure out where the change is. And that's where LiDAR is coming in, right? So if we have these 2 dates of LiDAR, change really pops out. And I think one of the most exciting things that we have in these locations where we've got multiple dates of LiDAR, we can map tree canopy change. So if you take a look at the orange areas here, which is tree canopy loss, watch what happens when we go to the next time period. You can see how they become smooth because those trees have been removed. At the same time, if you watch those green areas, they look pretty smooth here, and then the tree canopy has grown. And so LiDAR data is incredibly valuable in these cases because it allows us to do these fine scale measurements that we cannot do with imagery alone. And what I'm really excited going forward is in places where we have LiDAR for multiple dates is being able to account for canopy growth. We know our trees are growing. It's just really, really hard to measure that because it happens at such a fine scale. And it's especially true with our larger, more mature trees, right? They're still growing. However, it's these tiny increments, but it's all around their crowns, and that can really add up and sometimes even offset our losses. And this allows us to tell the story, right? And a lot of you have seen the Maryland Technical Forest Study. This is a really interesting example from the city of Boston. This is all of the Boston's neighborhoods, okay? And this is tree canopy change. So if you look at the bars to the left, that neighborhood is losing tree canopy. And if you look at the bars to the right, that neighborhood is gaining tree canopy. So overall, the city of Boston is kind of breaking even in terms of tree canopy. A little bit more loss than gain, but not much. But if we look at that breakdown by neighborhood, and then we look at it by land use, we see that the story is far more nuanced, right? You can take someplace like central Boston, right? We're seeing increases in all areas, evident of a very aggressive urban tree planting and maintenance program there. And then we see evidence in places like Dorchester, where a lot of the public open space and the rights of way where the government controls the land, the urban forestry programs there are really having an effect. But then if we look to the left, we see the residential land, that in yellow, they're losing a lot of tree canopy. And that's why this fine scale mapping, where we can detect trees at a sub-meter level and then split it out on property parcel boundaries, is really, really valuable because it allows us to get to these fine scale details that help us dive into that nuanced story so that we can direct funds and resources to the areas that need it. Now, what you're not seeing in this bar chart is a lot of the stuff that Tanya presented on. We don't know the species, we don't know the health of these trees, all of those things. So I want you to take away that there's a lot that we can do from above, but we can't do everything. And that's why we need these complementary approaches. They're absolutely crucial. So I'll wrap up with some sort of emerging technology. So I'm really privileged to have an amazing drone team here. And we use this technology for a variety of purposes, from disaster response to forest monitoring. I want to be really clear about drones. You're not going to map all of your forests in Maryland using drone technology. But if you have smaller areas where you need to track changes over time, or you're dealing with things like invasive species, drone technology is incredibly valuable. And I'd like to share just a little bit of our work as we wrap up here. So this is a forested area in Vermont. It's closed canopy, and this is June. So you should see green trees everywhere. And what you don't, you see this pinkish color because we're using multispectral imagery here. And you see these sort of wispy gray areas. Those are all trees that have been ravaged by spongy moth. It used to be called gypsy moth. It's done tremendous amount of damage to this location. And in order to get a better understanding of how our forests react to these invasive species, we need to map on a more regular basis than we can do with our other methods. So drones allow us to get into these areas really, really quickly. They allow us to operate under clouds if there's conditions where the satellites and the planes above cannot even see there. And they certainly give us that higher temporal frequency, right? We can do more regular visits out there. And this was really interesting because we got to see not only the devastation to the forest in this particular case, but how it responded over time. So this is about a month later, and then this is about 2 months later. Okay, so we see that most of the trees 2 months later have recovered, right? We see a few there that didn't do well. And then if we're concerned what happens next year, right? If we have another year with high spongy moss, we're going back this year to revisit just to see how these trees are doing. These types of tools, these drones are out there. And I think what's really exciting going forward is you take something like FIA, or maybe you folks are involved in work where you go out to do the field measurements and mapping. In the future, I think we'll be integrating drone technology with that, so we can have a comprehensive understanding of the forest by looking at the ground up and also then from above ground. So I'll wrap things up there, and once again, look forward to hearing whatever questions it is you folks have.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, a lot of really interesting information in there. I certainly have a few questions, but I'll give preference to our audience members. So again, please do feel free to add questions into that Q&A chat box. We do have a couple of questions from Lee Meadows, who has asked for, I think we can start with Tanya. Lee was asking whether northern red oaks are suffering higher mortality than southern red oaks in coastal Maryland. That may have been based on one of those dashboards.
Yeah, so I have to say I don't know at the top of my head, but I saw the question and was kind of trying to play with the dashboard. So I'm going to just go ahead, if it's okay, to share my screen just briefly here. And you know, so in this dashboard, you can kind of you can see it's divided by groups of oaks. So the select red oaks would include the northern red oak, and the other oaks would include southern red oak. You can see in the lower eastern shore, the data is very sparse. So here's the, you know, the map view. And if you click on this, you pull up this interactive sort of just list of estimates. And as I looked through here, it gives the average annual mortality. You can see the sampling errors are very high. So, you know, we can't really say this definitively, but the estimate with high sampling errors for the select red oak, which would include the northern red oak, was larger than the other red oak mortality, 173,000 cubic feet versus 120,000 cubic feet. So I say that, you know, we can explore the data, but the data, when you kind of boil down to that level of specificity, often has high sampling errors, and it's difficult to really draw conclusions from that. So.
Great, thank you. But also just a great opportunity to see some of the applications for that dashboard in play. And for Jarlath, I believe you touched on this already about LiDAR being used for species identification, but are there other remote data sets like that multispectral imaging that you're using that where you can determine some of like the species assemblages that are present?
Yeah, so the work on species detection with remotely sensed data, so mapping from above, whether you're using LiDAR or multispectral, it can work really, really well. If you're in Lake Tahoe and there's like 3 species of conifers, great, right? In our eastern forests, doesn't matter if you're here in the Green Mountains of Vermont or in Maryland, there's just so many species with interlocking canopies. There's not an easy way to distinguish them. There is technology called hyperspectral imagery. It tends to be very expensive to deploy and to calibrate. And this is why the techniques like FIA, we still need those field measurements. They're absolutely crucial to understand our species, to understand our growth of our trees, to understand things like DBH. We can get at some things that approximate those from above, but we can't come close to the level of precision that Tanya and the FIA team can get on the ground. So think of remote sensing, great for mapping broad areas. I would say relatively attribute poor compared to what FIA can get on the ground, right? But highly complementary. And I think sometimes we make the mistake of trying to do things that are very expensive and that we can't do well from above. That's not a reason to not try them from a research perspective. I think now it's sort of pretty clear. There's stuff that we can do amazingly well when mapping from above, and there's things that for over time, we can do very, very well from the field, and we should really try to bring these things together.
Great, thank you. See, and Gary would like to ask whether LiDAR can track the speed of invasive species spread and severity.
Yeah, Gary. So let's just come back to the spongy moth example I showed, right? So when we have those images there and we have LiDAR for that area, just from the drone data alone, we wouldn't know what is causing that. We know from the ground, if you could go out there, actually, you could actually hear, or if you stood out there, you would get covered. And I'm sure some of you have had this happen. You would get covered in the little green droplets of the spongy moth poop. It was kind of gross. There were so many, you could actually hear them. It sounded like it was raining in the forest. They were just going to town on those leaves. So I think where remotely sensed data comes in is we don't know it's spongy moth there, but tracking that spread at that level of detail, we can do that extremely well, right? You can imagine how long it would take to move through hundreds or thousands of acres of forest and inventorying the health of all of those trees, right? If we know there's a spongy moth outbreak and we want to map that and we want to map the recover of it, that's where something like drone technology works incredibly well.
Yeah, and would it be a similar process for invasive vegetation? So around here, for example, porcelain berry, maybe a little bit more difficult to distinguish, or?
Yeah, it becomes a little bit more difficult. We've had, I think, sort of some promising success doing things like looking at buckthorn in some areas because we see that signature under the tree canopy. I wouldn't say we're mapping buckthorn, but what we can do is we can say, there's stuff under the tree canopy there in this forested area that looks like buckthorn, right? So if you're doing a removal process, we can at least narrow it down, right? And reduce your effort from having to go to every single location in the forest. We can probably knock you down to sort of like 10% of the areas that you thought you would have to go to. And I think that's, once again, the power of remote sensing. We don't always need to do it right. If we can help you be more efficient and effective, then I think that's a win.
Great, thank you. And again, just a reminder to participants, please do feel free to add questions into the Q&A chat. In the meantime, I would love to hear more about the QA/QC and ground truthing process, both for things like FIA and for some of these remote sets. And mostly I'm interested whether there are particular errors or error types that have really emerged, and if there's any interesting patterns based on those that you all have observed.
So, you know, the process of QA/QC in FIA is, you know, there's some blind checks of FIA field crews and some quality control on, you know, how close estimates have to be, how repeatable they are. So I would say, well, one of the things is FIA is striving to become more nationally consistent. So I think that effort has really caused us to kind of, you know, take hold of differences in the way we do things and look at, you know, field crew calls and sort of beef up, you know, training for field crews, because there have been some, you know, issues identified with species identification. And different things. So yeah, I definitely feel like, you know, it's a continuous improvement process, I guess.
Yeah, and Megan, from our perspective and doing it from above, the challenge is quite often by the time we get these data, they're at least a few months old, and they have such detail that we can really see what we need to. Our real effort is we need to make sure that we do quality control. We can do that manually. I think one of the challenges we're going to see in the future is a lot of you are probably hearing about AI and this and that, and you've used Chat GPT, right? Maybe some of you just finished writing your performance reviews with it. You find that it's very, very, very valuable, and then it gets some things absurdly wrong. And that is true with AI mapping of tree canopy. And when you have these very, very small differences, right? So let's say your county has increased by 2%, or maybe it's lost 2% in tree canopy, and you hear companies saying that, well, our tree mapping is 97% accurate. That sounds super impressive, and it's not nearly accurate enough to give you the level of precision you need to make informed decisions about which way your tree canopy is going, right? 97% will have you thinking it's going one way or the other way. You're within the margin of error. And I think that's one of the big challenges out there, is that when it comes to tracking change over time, our margin of error has to really, really be precise, right? What we can get away with the peer-reviewed literature, if we publish at 92, 95%, we're doing awesome, is far below what we need for management level decisions, at least when we're mapping from above. And that is why our work is so challenging, and all these advances in AI and whatever are great. Really what they've done for us is allowed us to produce okay data a lot faster. It still doesn't get us across the finish line.
Right. And Gary, I don't know if you want to just unmute and ask a couple of the questions that you had.
Sure. Thank you, friends. Let me simply say I really appreciate the detail and breadth of the discussion and the presentations you've just made. I think they're fantastic, and the very kind of thing that I think many forest professionals, and frankly, many people just interested in tracking what's going on in the woods and are represented by the hundreds of stakeholders that have an interest in it, are interested in knowing how this data is generated and how it is presented in the future. Obviously, we still need more data in this area. So let me ask two questions, one of Tanya and one of Jarlath, and I'll start with Tanya. Tanya, you mentioned the fact that we'd had an earlier presentation on the urban FIA, and you've been talking about the national FIA. Can you talk about briefly about how these are being integrated in the future so that we have a more complete and in-depth picture from the standpoint of the data source that you are describing for the whole state? Tell us how these things are integrated in your work.
So I guess the main point of union between the urban FIA program and the traditional forest land program is the consistency in protocols between the two programs. So we have information on land uses. They're the same land uses. We collect the tree level data the same. We add more information in the urban data related to, urban specific needs, in addition to the ability to look at ecosystem services using the iTree tool. But really, they are separate databases at this point. The ultimate goal is to have sort of more of an all lands, kind of what Jarlath was talking about, expanding out beyond, to sort of have an all lands approach to FIA. So urban is sort of a first step toward that. We're not capturing, or we're not measuring trees in agricultural areas, except in portions of sort of the plain states with that trees outside of forest land inventory. So the urban forest that we're capturing with the urban forest inventory is really a small subset of trees that are present, like Jarlath said, or seen certainly from above, that we don't measure in urban FIA. So I guess protocols are the same. We're developing ways that we can look at the data together, but urban FIA is sort of in the beginning stages, and even with that, we're missing a large portion of non-forest trees.
Okay, thank you. Jarlath, I want you to conclude your work because you're cutting edge, in my opinion. And one of the cutting edge issues in Maryland is our concern about climate change. So what I'd like you to talk to us about just in closing is what do you see as the implications for your work for helping us to better understand the benefits and value of forests on the parameters of climate change in our country? In other words, how is this overview evolving to help us better understand how it can be used for the management of our lands to mitigate some of the expected consequences of climate change?
Yeah, Gary, I'll come back to where I started, which is my opinion that we need to be able to measure stuff if we're going to make decisions about it. And when we measure things, it becomes meaningful, right? If we're looking to improve, right, our trash collection, right, or improve the maintenance of our roads, we're going to be documenting that. And I think what's great about the technology now, both in terms of what FIA is doing and what we're doing, is we can document it. So we're going to know if we're having an impact on stemming forest loss, right? Or if we're going to have an impact perhaps in some of our inner cities and reversing past racist practices that have led to inequitable distributions of tree canopy, right? We're going to be able to map that stuff. We're going to be able to measure it. We're going to be able to integrate it with other data sets like urban heat island mapping. We're going to be able to give our communities, our citizens, right, all the people that are involved in our democratic process the information they need to chart a greener future. So we'll know where we stand. It won't be just something that we're saying, hey, look at us, we have this initiative. We're going to be able to verify it. And I think that's incredibly important because it holds all of us accountable.
Amen. Amen. Well, obviously, friends, I want to thank you again for being a part of today's webinar. And all of those who are tuned in today or may be watching this in the future, I hope you understand that data and understanding the information about what forests are all about is essential to good forest management. And as we look ahead at the challenges that still confront us in the future and the quality of life issues in the areas where we live, and particularly urban areas, they are really significantly impacted by the kind of data that we've been talking about here today, because that's the basis of good management and good stewardship for the future of forest resources in Maryland. Let me thank all of you for tuning in today. Megan, any closing comments?
Nope. Well said, Gary. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you very much, friends. And tune in again, third Thursday of May for our next webinar in this series. Look forward to having all of you join us then. Thank you very much for your time today.